Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
Almost a year after the bodies of the McStay family had been found, authorities announced they believed they had found the killer. They arrested Chase Merritt in November 2014.
And they made it very clear nobody else was involved. We're extensive in our investigation. Nobody else was involved. And it happened in the home.
Chase Merritt's defense attorney said those words during opening statements as his trial started in January 2019 in a San Bernardino, California courtroom. It was going to be a showdown, a marathon of a trial lasting nearly 6 months and bringing multiple witnesses to the stand to give information on the lives of Chase, Joseph, and their business. The prosecution lacked a smoking gun, so to speak, but asked the jury to piece together circumstantial evidence and to look at the big picture to connect Chase to the murders. If convicted, Chase could face the death penalty. Leading up to this point, and even later during the trial, Chase was unhappy with his defense and fired or tried to fire his legal team. As the trial got underway, however, he had a team of defense attorneys at his side who were ready to contest the prosecution's interpretation of the financial records, phone call logs, and witness statements. Outside the courtroom, the media was closely following the high-profile case. The Los Angeles Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, CNN, and other media outlets had covered the family's disappearance and were now writing updates about the legal proceedings. Law and Crime live-streamed the trial, so thousands of people tuned in from around the world, debating Chase's guilt or innocence, or sharing their own theories in the YouTube comments. In Part 1, I covered the disappearance of the McStay family and the investigation into what happened to them. They first went missing in February 2010, and after years of searches, investigations, and media coverage, the bodies of 40-year-old Joseph McStay, 43-year-old Summer McStay, and their 2 sons, Gianni, 4, and Joe Jr., 3, were found in 2 shallow graves about 100 miles from their family home. About a year after that, the arrest of Joseph's business associate, Charles Chase Merritt, who was charged with their murders. As I said earlier, it was quite a trial. And in today's episode, we're going to get right into it. This is Jillian, and you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 139, part 2. In their opening statements, supervising Deputy District Attorney Sean Doherty laid out greed and fraud as the motives for the family's violent deaths.
Joseph McStay, 40 years old. His wife, Summer. Their 2 kids, Gianni, who was 4 years old, and Joe Jr., who 4 days before they were murdered had just turned 3. The how is that they were beaten about the head and face until they died. And then they were taken 100 miles away from their home and buried in the desert. The why boils down to a basic human emotion, something that we discussed during jury selection. The why boils down to greed. The why boils down to greed and greed's child, fraud.
Doherty said Chase claimed to be Joseph's best friend, but he was actually forging checks from Joseph's business and stealing money from him. putting his hands in the cookie jar, he said. Doherty told the jury that Chase's cell phone activity around the time of the murders was off the grid. Nowhere to be found, he said, when all other times it's always found. Chase also desperately tried to cover his tracks after the murder, he said. He misled investigators, he talked in circles, and he played the victim. Doherty alleged that Chase also took $5,000 from Joseph's mother under the guise of completing a project and never paid her back.
The who, ladies and gentlemen, is the defendant. And those lies and that misleading, that talking in circles and that playing the victim worked for a time, for almost 4 years.
He said Joseph met Chase in 2006 or 2007. Chase fancied himself as an entrepreneur, a welder, and a designer, and he and Joseph began working together. He described how investigators first learned about Chase, how Chase had actually gone to the McStay family home with Mike McStay, Joseph's brother, a couple days prior to Mike reporting them missing. Doherty played snippets of investigators' interview with Chase and pointed out the part where detectives asked him why he kept referring to Joseph in the past tense.
No one knows that they're dead. San Diego's conducting a missing persons investigation, and he's saying Joseph was my best friend. He's saying the kids were energetic.
He said one thing Chase didn't mention to detectives when talking to them about the business's finances is that he owed Joseph a little more than $42,000. That on February 1st, 2010, Joseph sent Chase an email stating as such. Doherty acknowledged that none of the leads San Diego police uncovered panned out for them, and that they eventually turned the case over to the FBI. This was shortly before November 11th, 2013, shortly before the bodies were found. After the bodies were found, he said San Bernardino County sheriffs took over the investigation. They had more resources, and they investigated it for more than a year. He said they learned some interesting things about what occurred in early February, right before the family disappeared. Doherty then went into a long timeline of events leading up to and after the murders. Don't worry about paying specific attention to each detail in what I'm about to say. I'll recap it after. Doherty said San Bernardino investigators gained access to Joseph's online ledger systems, his QuickBooks records. They found that on February 1st, 3 days before his disappearance, Joseph's QuickBooks was accessed, but not from any computers at the McStay house. Joseph had just sent that email to Chase that said Joseph had overpaid him, and the total owed to him now was $42,000. About 45 minutes after receiving that email, someone went into Joseph's QuickBooks and added Charles Merritt as a vendor. The name Charles Merritt was all lowercase. Doherty said that whenever Joseph would enter a vendor, he would capitalize the first letter. 2 checks were then created for $2,500 each. Then both were deleted, meaning they wouldn't show up on the ledger. Then, the next day, Doherty said someone again went into Joseph's QuickBooks. Again, not from any of the McStay's computers, and 2 more checks were added to Charles Merritt. They were printed and then deleted. This was something Joseph had never done before, Doherty said. That same day, on February 2nd, one of the checks was cashed at the bank. 2 days later, on February 4th, the day the McStays disappeared, Joseph McStay called a number associated with his bank. He has called that number in the past, Doherty said, when they were buying their house, but he didn't call it often. 2 minutes later, he called Chase. After that, he signed into his QuickBooks and signed out 2 minutes later. After he signed out, he called his bank again. Doherty surmised that he was calling again because he didn't see the check Chase had written to himself and had deleted on the ledger, the check that had by now been cashed. Doherty said that while he's making some of these calls, Joseph was traveling. He arrived in the Rancho Cucamonga area, where Chase lives, around 12:52 p.m. and called Chase at that time. Joseph's phone then remained in that area until it last pinged that tower at 3:03 p.m. Doherty said this is the day Chase told investigators that he and Joseph met at a Chick-fil-A. "There is a Chick-fil-A in this area," he told the jury. Doherty said that after Joseph called Chase between 12:52 p.m. and 1:01 p.m., there are, quote, 13 frantic phone calls, primarily from Chase to his wife. She calls him back at 1 p.m. Doherty said if there was some sort of meeting between Joseph and Chase here, this is when it would be. He said after the meeting, Joseph called Chase 7 times. The longest call was just over 2 minutes at 5:48 p.m. Joseph's phone had since traveled southbound, back near his home at that time.
After that 5:48 p.m. contact with the defendant's cell phone goes off the grid. And that is to say it's either turned off, it's in airplane mode, or it's somewhere where it's not connecting with any towers. From 5:48 p.m. on February 4th to 9:32 p.m., his cell phone is not connecting any towers. And there are, during that time period, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 calls between 6:09 and 9:04 from Catherine Jarvis, his wife at the time, to the defendant. And voicemail messages are left.
Doherty told the jury that at 7:47 p.m., a neighbor's surveillance video showed a vehicle driving by. They initially believed that it was the McStay's Isuzu Trooper, but now they believe it was Chase's truck. At 7:56 p.m., someone accessed Joseph's QuickBooks from the McStay's home computer at Joseph's desk, added a check to Charles Merritt, all lowercase, deleted it, and signed out. At 8:28 p.m., Joseph's cell phone records shows a phone call to Chase, but during this time, Chase's phone was off, and Chase's records don't show a call. At 9:32 p.m., Chase calls his wife, and his phone connects to a tower just south of Rancho Cucamonga where he lives. After that, his phone is off the grid until 7:30 the next morning. The next day, on February 5th, 4 more checks were created in Joseph's QuickBooks account, not from the McStay's home. 2 of them were to Charles Merritt, all lowercase. These were backdated to the 4th, the last day the family was known to be alive, Doherty said. They were then deleted. Later that day, on the 5th, from 3:54 p.m. through 9:17 p.m., Chase's cell phone is again off the grid. On February 6th, Chase's cell phone pinged towers in the area near where the bodies were found. And on February 8th, the day the McStay's family trooper was towed, from 7:26 a.m. to 1:31 p.m., his cell phone was again off the grid. When it comes back on the grid, he's traveling north back to his residence. Doherty said again after this, QuickBooks was accessed and another check to Charles Merritt, all lowercase, was added, printed, backdated to February 4th, and then deleted. Then there's a 107-minute phone call to QuickBooks.
The caller identified himself as Joseph McStay. The number he was calling from was the defendant's phone number. There was some indication of canceling a subscription, getting a new version. He tells San Diego investigators, Joseph gave me his credit card number, even though we're 2 different companies and I don't even do all of his fountains, gave me his credit card number to get a new version of QuickBooks. The check to Charles Merritt was created. It was backdated to February 4th, printed and deleted, and it was deposited on February 9th, 2010. The 2 checks to Metro Sheet Metal that were written on the 5th and backdated to the 4th, those were held on until March by the bookkeeper because they didn't look right. It wasn't like what she'd gotten from Joseph in the past. On February 9th, again, someone calls QuickBooks, claiming to be Joseph McStay, but calling from the defendant's cell phone number. Customer service representative who took the call said that the customer was adamant that they needed all of the information in the QuickBooks account deleted. In fact, he knows they were adamant because in his customer service notes, he wrote in all caps, needs. All of the information deleted. So he told Mr. McStay, calling from the defendant's cell phone, I need to send you an email as the administrator with what you need to do, the steps you need to take to do that. He didn't hear anything. He sent another email. He still didn't hear anything.
Doherty warned that there will be unanswered questions in the case. He said they can't tell if anyone helped Chase with the murders or with the moving of the bodies, including moving 2 grown adult bodies. But he said they can tell that Chase definitely did it, that he was ripping off his best friend and he got caught. And the only connection to the high desert where the bodies were found, he said, is Chase. It's an area near where he grew up and attended high school when he was younger. Doherty asked the jury to hold Chase accountable and find him guilty of first-degree murder. Now, before I get into the defense's opening statements, I want to summarize the prosecution's theory. Sometimes, with all the dates and times, things can get kind of confusing, especially when listening on a podcast. The prosecution believes that Chase and Joseph had a falling out on February 4th. Specifically, that Joseph found out that Chase was writing checks to himself and stealing money from the business. They met up at some point that day near Chase's house. Afterwards, they say Joseph went home, and after that, Chase's phone goes off the grid. This is when prosecutors believe the McStay family members were murdered sometime this night. They believe the family was murdered in their home, and then Chase took their bodies and buried them at the gravesite 2 days later on February 6th. And then on February 8th, he left their car, their Isuzu Trooper, at the border. He then continued to write checks to himself from Joseph's account. Now, the defense, as you can imagine, has a very different theory of the crime. Defense attorney James McGee presented their opening statements.
Don't believe everything you hear from a witness until we get to cross, because the picture looks a lot different when you actually get to have a little light shined on what they're trying to sell you.
According to the defense, the prosecution skated over the fact that Chase was worried about Joseph's well-being and had contacted Joseph's family. McGee dismissed the prosecution's focus of Chase using the past tense during the police interview. He called it an example of confirmation bias. He said the prosecution went in with blinders on, determined to view the evidence through a lens that Chase Merritt was guilty. He pointed to the autopsies of the family's remains. It was clear their deaths had been violent. They suffered blunt force trauma to their heads. Blood would be everywhere in the house if the family had been killed there by a sledgehammer. Blood would coat the killer. Instead, no traces of blood were found in their house, he noted.
Like I said, the blood will also be over the perpetrator, over his clothes, hands, shoes from walking in this. It would transfer throughout the house. It would transfer out to the outside. It would transfer to the car they got in. It would be everywhere. No blood was found in the residence. Not a drop. Not a trace. Not a speck. Detective Dugal from the homicide unit in the San Diego Sheriff's Department walked through that house and said, "This is not a crime scene. It did not happen here."
He said even when Joseph's family went in to clean up, they never saw any blood, and no neighbors reported hearing anything.
What the evidence is going to show that the murders did not happen in that house. That day. Didn't happen. What actually shows from the evidence is that the family was probably alive until the morning of the 5th. Because everything that was out was recovered. Coffee was made. Coffee mug was down. Eggs were out. Little popcorn to keep the kids happy while you're making them breakfast. Little fruit for them to nibble on. This is stuff you give them in the morning. The dogs were in the backyard. You will hear Summer loved those dogs. They always slept inside. First thing in the morning, when you have a dog inside all day, is you put them out so they can go to the bathroom. They were outside. The clothes that they were all wearing, when their bodies were recovered, all indicate clothing you would sleep in and wake up to. This family was alive until the morning. They were not killed in that house on the 4th.
He said the prosecution says Chase disposed of the bodies 2 days later, and there's also a major issue with that.
The problem is there's no blood in his truck. Now, as we know, blood spatter would be all over the assailant from crushing those heads with the sledgehammer. Blood would have dripped out of the back of the truck when you're driving around for 2 days. Because he drove all over, blood will move. There's nobody complaining of smell coming from his truck. Remember, he lives in a busy apartment. He parks in the middle of all the other cars. It's not like he has his own little ranch or house that he can hide in. He lives in front of hundreds of people. Nobody said anything about that. No evidence of him moving bodies into any kind of garage or apartment or anything. He's got 4 dead bodies in the back.
He said law enforcement did a thorough search of the truck and didn't find any blood. Nothing. He said the defense believes that the McStay family was alive on the morning of the 5th, and that Chase actually drove to Los Angeles that morning for a job. He called Joseph's phone twice to give him an update on it, he said. Then Chase went home. He said the prosecution's other theory is that instead of taking the bodies with him after he killed them at their home, Chase left the bodies inside the home until February 6th. But he said the evidence doesn't support that either. The bodies would have continued to bleed out, and you wouldn't have been able to clean that up. He said crime scene investigators pulled up all the carpeting and thoroughly went through the house. There was no blood found.
Funny thing is also, the San Diego investigators, they brought in cadaver dogs actually to look for blood. Nothing. But for you to believe their story of their theory of the case, the family was killed in the house with no trace. It's impossible.
He said the prosecution had initially alleged that Joseph was wrapped up in a futon cover, a cover that investigators had noticed was missing when they went through the home. But now they're saying it was a blanket, he said. They had wanted to say it was the futon cover because that would link the crime back to the house. McGee then went over the injuries the family had suffered and how they were found in the graves. He told the jury that one thing they will learn about Summer is that she was a very strong-willed woman who was very protective of her family. He said they believe that her jaw was broken while she was fighting for her family's life. He noted that Chase didn't have any injuries on him consistent with having fought with her. He told the jury that Summer's sweatpants and panties were not found on her body. They were pulled off, together, intermixed, he said. They were found next to her head. Her bra strap and left cup were inside the grave with her, and the right cup was found outside. And between the two, it was cut, he said. He said they believe that Summer was raped before she was murdered, and so did one of the sergeants, who included that in his DNA request form. He said the defense believes the family was not murdered together in the house at one time, arguing Joseph was killed separately somewhere else, and then his body was moved to the gravesite, which is why he was found wrapped up and the others weren't.
Somebody killed Joseph somewhere and brought him to that gravesite. Summer and the kids, on the other hand, evidence shows were killed there. That's why they weren't wrapped up. That's why she was raped there before she was killed. That's why her clothes are half out of the grave, half in the grave, ripped off her body. They were killed at separate times. They were brought in separate vehicles.
McGee also criticized the investigation at the gravesite, saying investigators didn't take pictures or measurements of how far the items were from one another. And he said there were actually 2 murder weapons, the sledgehammer and a knife.
They could have been stabbed to death, bleeding, and their heads crushed with a 3-pound sledgehammer to make sure it's done. If you're one person, why do you need 2?
McGee also disagreed with the prosecution's assertion that Chase was the only one in the case who knew Victorville, the area where the bodies were found. He said he would say that where the bodies were found shows that the perpetrator didn't know where he was. The location where the bodies were found was the first geographical location that was undeveloped when heading north of Fallbrook on the 15 freeway. The grave sites were a quarter mile from the freeway. He said if the killer had just driven up a little further, he would have found a more secluded area. Then, McGee told the court that the DNA from the gravesite actually excludes Chase Merritt, a fact no one knows until now, he said.
That the DNA evidence found inside those graves, we found it. See, the investigators, when they checked everything, they did a swab. They took a little piece of cotton and said, okay, is there anything on that? Nope, okay, no DNA. Suzanne Ryan, who is our DNA specialist, says, no. You need to do what's called an M-vac. Best way to describe it, it's like a wet vac. It sprays a saline solution and you vacuum all that solution off and it's caught in a filter. It's 100 times more accurate at picking up DNA than just swab. Through this process, she was able to find DNA in almost every item she tested. And she'll say it's degraded. It's not something that was just placed there. It's simply broken down from being in the ground. Items that we had tested was stuff that was wrapped around Joseph. So whoever's killing them and wrapping them up, that's a good place to look because it's their DNA that's going to get on that because you're getting hands sweating, you're pulling them off. We also want to look at the clothes that were taken off Summer's body. So we checked the bra and the panties. And DNA was found on those items. It was a digital result was generated. Those digital results were sent to a company that does a computer software analysis. Preliminary computer analysis is all we have now. Final results are due in 2 days. But they have developed profiles on those 5 items. They say we should be able to develop profiles. There's 4 of them. They said they're of unknown subjects, meaning it's not the McStay family, it's not Charles Merritt. They have been all excluded from the evidence inside the grave. So apparently, Chase killed this family, buried them, and put someone else's DNA on everything, and not his own. And we're still going to trial.
As for the cell phone evidence, the prosecution says shows Chase was near the gravesite on February 6th. He said the prosecution's expert has no technical training or education whatsoever.
He has no expertise on the engineering behind the system or how they actually work. He is just told, hey, here's what you should say, just parrot it back. I've been to trainings. I've been to 40-hour trainings. What they do, they told me to say this. You'll find he did not submit a written report detailing his findings. No report. Nobody can subject anything he's going to say to review. We'll have to figure it out on the fly when he's saying it. Why are they hiding that? Why are they afraid to write it?
McGee told the jury they would also hear about DNA evidence that was found in the family's Isuzu Trooper. He said on the steering wheel, Joseph was the major contributor, Chase was the minor contributor, and Summer was a trace contributor. On the center console, Joseph was the major contributor, Summer was the minor contributor, and Chase was the trace contributor. He said it's notable that none of Chase's DNA was found where you'd expect it if he had driven the vehicle.
If I'm driving a vehicle, I'm going to get in, I'm going to close the door, I'm going to put on my seatbelt, check the mirrors, move the seat if it's too short, all that. If I'm touching the steering wheel and the gear shift, I'm touching that too. No DNA on any of that stuff. And the seat was positioned up. They already covered for us. Makes my job easier. Joseph was a lot shorter than Chase. He was still in the drive position where Joseph would have.
So how did his DNA get there? McGee said it was DNA transfer from the last person Joseph saw that day, Chase. They met for lunch and likely shook hands. McGee showed a video of how the transfer DNA could have produced those results. Joseph shook Chase's hand, got into his car, touched the steering wheel, then touched the gear shift in the center console. That's why Chase's DNA went from a minor contributor on the steering wheel to a trace contributor on the gear shift. McGee also pointed to the fact that fingerprints were found in the trooper. Fingerprints of an unknown person were found on a coffee mug. Finally, McGee said the prosecution's motive, that he killed Joseph for money, didn't make sense. Why would Chase murder the business associate who is going to make him a millionaire, since Earth-inspired products had lined up such lucrative orders over the next several years?
When they talked about the money that's coming in, money's going to be great. Yes, I owed him some money, but we have $82,000 coming in on these jobs. Not to mention, we have another waterfall development coming with Mr. Clean. That's $18,000 a waterfall. That's 500 possible orders over the next 10 years if we do this whole franchise. That's $9 million over 10 years. That's coming down the pipe. I'm going to kill him over $30,000 or $900 when I have my share of $9 million coming?
So if the defense's theory was that Chase was in fact innocent, who did they believe the real killer was? Well, that would definitely come out at trial. During the trial, the prosecution brought in evidence that further outlined their timeline of the murders. They gave the jury a closer look at the surveillance video from the front porch of a neighbor of the McStays. The limited footage she provided showed that at 7:47 p.m. on February 4th, a vehicle drove past her home before appearing to hit the brakes. The whole vehicle wasn't captured in the footage. And then there was this. The neighbor told the court that it was normally a quiet neighborhood, but she recalled on the stand at one point hearing a noise that caused her to turn her porch light on. She had heard something, although she didn't remember what, on the night of February 4th. By using extensive modeling and measuring both the shadows in the video and the dimensions of Chase's vehicle, in what amounted to a long, complicated explanation, the prosecution said it was Chase's truck captured in the video. As for any footage from the days after February 4th, the neighbor said her camera stopped working and thus picked up nothing from February 5th through February 14th. Kevin Bowles, a special agent with the FBI, testified that Chase's cell phone hit off an AT&T cell phone tower about 2 miles from the gravesite multiple times on February 6, 2010, starting at 11:30 a.m. to 11:52 a.m., and then again at 1:30 p.m. But the defense argued that it's not impossible for a cell phone to connect with a relatively distant tower, despite being closer to other towers. The defense also pointed out other times where Chase's phone was off the grid, including multiple times in January. Sergeant Ryan Smith of the San Bernardino Sheriff's Office was called to the stand multiple times. He had been a detective who was involved in the McStay investigation that conducted more than 200 interviews. He detailed their investigation for the jury. Under cross by the defense, Sergeant Smith acknowledged that he couldn't determine exactly when the McStays were buried in the desert.
Can you tell from the gravesite what day they were put in the ground? If you're referring to like soil samples or stuff like that, no. We base that on the totality of the evidence as to the last time anyone heard from them.
Other evidence against Chase included his cell phone search history. He searched how to change your identity after the McStays' remains had been found. The defense confronted Sergeant Smith about Dan Kavanaugh, who had ended up in control of Joseph's business after the McStays disappeared. Dan sold the business later, although it was unknown how much he profited from it. Sergeant Smith admitted he didn't subpoena the contract for the sale of the business or find out the terms of the sale. He hadn't talked to Dan about it either, and he never subpoenaed Dan's PayPal or other financial records. Joseph's brother, Mike McStay, also took the stand multiple times. Mike testified that Joseph had asked him to learn how to weld so he could replace Chase at the business. But Mike, busy with life, hadn't had the chance to pick up the trade. The defense brought up a loan that Joseph had given Mike back in 2007. They asked Mike if he planned to bring up the loan with Joseph when he visited in early 2010.
This loan wasn't even on the radar. I have no idea why you're even asking this question. I didn't talk to him about this loan or anything for that, or whatever you're implying.
Mike acknowledged that it wasn't just Chase who had problems with Summer. Mike did too. In July 2009, at Gianni's birthday, the tension between Mike and Summer reached a boiling point, and Mike said he confronted her over the phone.
Like I think I testified, every family has squabbles. And certainly you guys the Aranda family has been drugged through the mud. So I'm going to answer this the best I can. And in context, hopefully, if you're really looking. Do you remember what the question is? Summer had I do. So there was a strain, like any friction on a family, between Summer and myself. Because of
non-responsive task to answer.
Yeah. She made a comment to my wife at the time about my children. I let it go. And then finally on July 4th, when we were running late to go to the party, I confronted her on it. But Summer is the mother of my murdered nephews. And I would have done anything for her, no matter what.
The prosecution called witnesses who described Chase as someone not to be trusted. He gambled. He fought with Summer. He was a thief, they said. Joseph's longtime friend, MacGyver McCarger, the one who had introduced Joseph to Summer, remembered Summer complaining about Chase. MacGyver could also tell Summer was overwhelmed with life. She was a mom to 2 little boys, and the couple had purchased a foreclosed house and were trying to renovate it. He came over to help her paint at the end of January 2010, just days before their disappearance. When MacGyver arrived, Chase was at the McStay's home.
He was kind of standing there as I walked in. I could feel the tension in the room between Summer and he, and right off the bat, I knew this is who Summer was talking about. She didn't introduce me. He didn't introduce himself. And she just kind of avoided him. And so I'm like, this must be the guy.
On cross, MacGyver recounted a conversation he had with Joseph then, on January 31st, when Joseph told him he had finally bought Dan out. David Joe Cicada, who was employed at his father's sheet metal company, came to know both Chase and Joseph as they developed an informal business arrangement. Chase worked in David's family workshop as they all worked on projects for Joseph's water fountain business. David testified that Chase was unreliable, so he often had to step up and complete what should have been Chase's responsibilities. David said he alerted Joseph that he was concerned about Chase's unproductivity. Chase also wasn't given free range of the workshop either. He would only be allowed to be in there when David or his father were present. David described one time when there was a discrepancy about payment.
We were on the phone. My father had him on hands-free.
With Mr. McStay?
With Mr. McStay.
Okay.
And he said that the check was given to Mr. Merritt, and at which point we told him, well, we never got it.
Were you personally aware of a confrontation with the defendant asking about where that payment was?
They had quite a few confrontations. Yeah.
Specifically, is this one where Mr. McStay indicated the check was being delivered by Mr. Merritt?
Yes.
And tell us how that happened.
Again, my dad doesn't pull no punches, and he's pretty blunt. And they got into a pretty heated argument about it.
You were present then?
I'm sorry?
You were present for that?
Yes. It came out into the shop.
He said Chase told them that he used the money for materials needed for the fountains, which David said wasn't true. The prosecution presented 35 witnesses over 28 days of testimony. Everyone from Deputy Tingley, Detective Troy Dugal, Joseph's mother, Susan Blake, Dr. Shanksy, as well as the team who excavated the grave sites, all taking the stand along with the business associates and family members in the McStay's circle. Noticeably absent from the stand, however, was Joseph's other business partner, Dan Kavanaugh, whose name was brought up occasionally throughout the trial. Dan's name had been on the prosecution's witness list, but they never called him, a fact that the judge ruled the jury could not hear. The defense's first witness was Taylor Jarvis, daughter of Chase Merritt. She testified that she remembers her mom and dad getting into an argument on the evening of February 4th, 2010. They argued over her father's habit of ignoring phone calls. She said Chase's phone had rung, that it was Joseph, and that he didn't take the call. As you'll remember, according to prosecutors, a phone call from Joseph's phone to Chase at 8:28 p.m. that night did show up on Joseph's phone records. However, it was not on Chase's. On cross, Taylor admitted that her father was irresponsible with money and often played poker. As promised in their opening statements, Chase's defense team called DNA experts to the stand to essentially testify that Chase's DNA had been excluded from items found in the gravesite. The testimony by these experts was extremely complex and not very easy to follow, but here's a basic summary of what was said. Susanna Ryan, a crime laboratory and forensic laboratory manager, told the jury that she used something called an MVAC system, which is sort of like a vacuum that sprays the items and then draws in the liquid from the items to analyze the DNA. She said the MVAC has provided 20 to 200 times more DNA than traditional DNA collection methods. 8 items were taken from inside the graves, along with 2 items from outside. Very small levels of DNA were detected on 5 of the items, a threshold too low for her company, Bodhi Technologies. So she recommended the items be sent to Cybergenetics, which works with low-level mixtures. Ryan also testified about the DNA in the family's Isuzu Trooper and said that because Joseph was a major contributor to the DNA found on the steering wheel and gear shift, that suggested he was likely the last person who drove it. Chase's DNA in the vehicle could be an instance of transfer, she said. On cross-examination, however, she was pressed on this by prosecutor Sean Doherty, who pointed out that she was making assumptions, like that Chase and Joseph had shaken hands, an idea the defense had put forth. He said she also assumed that the trooper wasn't wiped down, which would greatly reduce the amount of DNA. She agreed that the levels could have been consistent with someone wiping it down, or someone even wearing gloves. Doherty also pressed Ryan on what items from the gravesite were selected to be collected with the MVAC. She said she and the defense team had chosen items that would have likely been handled by the perpetrator, but she agreed that they hadn't tested the sledgehammer. Mark Perlin, the chief scientific and executive officer of Cybergenetics, testified about the low levels of DNA on the 5 items found in and around the graves. He said he concluded that Chase Merritt was excluded as the contributor of the DNA on an electrical cord found in one of the graves, as well as on the right and left bra cups, and on the white cord and red strap found wrapped around Joseph's body. The defense also called some of the detectives, now sergeants, to the stand who had worked on the case and some of whom had already testified for the prosecution. Sergeant Edward Bachman testified about an interview he and another detective had conducted with Dan Kavanaugh on September 20th, 2014. The interview took place in San Diego, where Dan was reportedly living at the time. Prior to the interview, authorities had requested a search warrant for Dan's cell phone records. Raj Maylene, another one of Chase's attorneys, asked Sergeant Bachman if in that search warrant he had a question as to the dates Dan Kavanaugh was in Hawaii, Dan's alibi for the murders. Sergeant Bachman replied that they were trying to verify that another detective was going to check with Hawaiian Airlines, and another was going to speak with Dan's girlfriend, Lauren. Sergeant Bachman admitted that to his knowledge, they were never able to secure a ticket or boarding pass for Dan, but he also said he wasn't the one who was handling that. Sergeant Bachman said they did obtain Dan's phone records, and that they showed that he was calling local establishments there in Hawaii. In addition to that, his girlfriend Lauren gave a statement that he was there and provided a photograph. Based on that, Sergeant Bachman said they believed he was there. But when asked if calling local establishments in Hawaii would require Dan to physically be there, Sergeant Bachman replied no. In their interview with Dan, he said they learned that Dan had since sold Joseph's company, Earth Inspired Products. Maylene asked if he ever asked Dan how it was that he was able to sell Joseph's company without Joseph's or his family's permission, and Sergeant Bachman said he didn't recall confronting him about that. Instead, he said Dan talked about Chase deleting accounts and that he was concerned. Maylene then asked if they had ever requested Dan's PayPal records, and Sergeant Bachman responded that they were looked into, but he wasn't that familiar with that aspect of the investigation. He did say, however, that the topic of PayPal and PayPal withdrawals did come up in their interview. He said Dan told them that he did take money out of the accounts. He couldn't recall an actual figure of the amount Dan said he withdrew, but he said he's sure that other detectives compared that figure to the actual records. When pressed further, Sergeant Bachman told the jury that Dan accessed Joseph's PayPal account within a week after the family went missing. Then Detective Troy Dugal also took the stand for the defense. He testified that he retrieved 25 voicemails from Joseph's cell phone and 31 from Summers. All of them started on or after February 15th. Investigators believed that in the days following their disappearance, the messages on their phones were deleted remotely from another device, since no other calls appeared on their cell phone records. Maylene also brought up how the prosecution was reading a lot into how Chase had referenced Joseph in the past tense in his interview with Detective Dugal. He pointed out various examples of the officers speaking about Joseph and his family in the past tense first. Detective Dugal agreed, after looking at the transcript, that that was true. Lastly, Maylene asked Detective Dugal about the motive prosecutors gave for the murders, that Chase had owed Joseph $42,000, as Joseph had listed out in his email on February 1st. Detective Dugal acknowledged that Chase provided them with that email, as well as with a ledger showing projects that Earth Inspired Products was currently involved in, and money that was coming in. Dennis Sjogren, a forensic accountant for the defense, testified that in the 10 months after the McStays disappeared, Dan Kavanaugh took over the business and diverted more than $200,000 from the company to himself. On cross, that exact amount was disputed, and prosecutors argued that it was somewhere around $126,000. They said the remaining amount was from work on Earth-inspired products. Sarah Kane is the custodian of records for PayPal. She testified that on February 10th, 6 days after the McStay's disappearance, Dan Kavanaugh hacked into Joseph's PayPal account and changed the password. Then, over the next couple days, he transferred $7,900 from Joseph's account to his. Brian LaRock, a computer system forensic analyst, confirmed that the IP address belonging to Dan did indeed hack into Joseph's PayPal account. LaRock also testified about Joseph's computer activity on the night of February 4th. He said that computer evidence shows that the Google SketchUp program was accessed on Joseph's computer from 4:10 p.m. to 5 p.m. on February 4th. He also testified that on the afternoon of February 4th, after Chase and Joseph's Chick-fil-A meeting likely occurred, there were several phone calls from Joseph to Chase, while Joseph appeared to be on his way home, according to the cell tower records. Then, at 4:18 p.m., another call was made from Joseph to Chase. This was around the same time that computer data shows that Joseph had been in the Google SketchUp program. When asked why that would be significant, LaRock started to say that it has the appearance that Joseph was working on a drawing and was talking to Chase at the same time. The prosecution objected and it was sustained, so he was unable to fully finish, but presumably he was suggesting that Chase and Joseph were working together, which would be after the prosecution says Joseph had confronted him about stealing money. According to LaRock, there was another call between Joseph and Chase at 5:47 p.m. and again at 8:28 p.m., which is that call that doesn't show up on Chase's phone records. Gary Robertson, a private investigator working with the defense, testified that he had attempted to locate Dan Kavanaugh and subpoena him to testify at trial, but was unable to locate him. The closing arguments recounted months of evidence and testimony, each side arguing it fit into their narratives of the case. Supervising Deputy District Attorney Britt Imes gave the closing arguments for the state. He reminded the jury that the prosecution didn't have to prove where the McStays were when they were killed, or when, or how. You can have a murder without answering those questions, he said.
Whether it was an argument with Joseph over finances, whether it was Summer because of hatred over how he was treated, and the disagreements over raising kids, the fact that he believed she was a bitch, whatever precipitated the first killing ultimately won't matter. Because what will matter is you intentionally then killed 3 other people. He could have stopped.
Imes picked up the sledgehammer that had been found at the gravesite and was now in a plastic bag and banged it down to signal the blows to the children's skulls. He then outlined the evidence they had presented at trial. The judge had told the jury that circumstantial and direct evidence carried equal weight.
You cannot look at facts in isolation. A single individual fact may have 2 reasonable interpretations. One points to guilt, one points to innocence. And that isolated individual fact, in that scenario, you would have to accept the one that points to innocence. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, when you're talking about the totality of a case that spans 6 months of your lives, almost 6 months, is you cannot look at those facts in isolation. One fact and how it is interpreted and what it means can be dictated by other pieces of evidence. Stuff that you may not have made those connections when you listen to them, or you may have forgotten, given the fact that we've been here almost 6 months.
Some of that evidence included that email Joseph sent Chase on February 1st, 2010, saying he had overpaid Chase by $15,000. That brought the total of what Chase owed Joseph to $42,000.
What state of mind would someone be in after receiving an email from your purported boss that says, you owe me $42,845? Most reasonable people, if they got a bill like that, would be pretty astonished. Chin would hit the floor. I owe how much?
Part of the circumstantial evidence was Joseph's suspicious financial records that pointed to Chase's guilt, Imes said, where Charles Merritt, all lowercase, was suspiciously added as a vendor and where multiple checks were added into the system, backdated, and then deleted from the ledger, some of which were cashed. As for their business meeting at Chick-fil-A on February 4th, the last time Chase said he saw Joseph, Imes said all the phone records make it seem unlikely that they spent hours there, as Chase had said. Chase was on the phone with his wife and on the internet throughout that day. Instead, Imes alleged that the events of that day played out differently. Instead of an hours-long casual business meeting, there was a confrontation between Joseph and Chase over the fraud.
You have no credit card activity. You don't show any activity in the defendant's bank account or Joe's bank account, swiping for lunch at Chick-fil-A. There's no surveillance video. There's no independent witnesses that came in and testified, yep, I saw them there. You don't find a receipt in the trooper or the truck. The only thing you can rely upon to make that conclusion is the self-interested statement of the defendant. But think about it. Use your common sense. You go to meet a business partner or a colleague for lunch. Does that colleague spend the entire afternoon on the internet, on their phone? Maybe a 16, 17, 20-year-old millennial does, because they can't put the phones down. But you're talking more older business people. And this is 2010. This is not 2019 standards. Better yet, does one half of that meeting repeatedly call the mother of their children 19 times while you're having a face-to-face lunch business meeting? If that's the case, it's very rude. But look at that alleged meeting in context.
After all this, Chase went off the grid, unreachable for 3.5 hours. Later, his phone pinged off cell phone towers near the graves in the desert on February 6th. When questioned by authorities, Chase denied ever going to the desert, despite his cell phone showing the opposite, Imes said.
So why would the defendant be there on the 6th? What other circumstances about this case where the defendant, when he's interviewed by San Bernardino in 2014, knows where the bodies are located, knows where they're discovered, knows his whereabouts, finds it important to lie to investigators and say, I was not in the desert on the 6th? Because the evidence would point to someone associated with the killing of the McStays was in the desert on the 6th.
Imes also brought up the tire tracks found at the gravesite.
And 2 sets of really deep impressions left from a vehicle leading to each grave. The measurements of these worn and aged tire depressions are consistent with the defendant's truck. And most importantly, you got to remember, context is important. These are being viewed in 2013, not in 2010. 3 years, 3 winters, 3 summers have passed. Aging those depressions in dirt with wind and rain, possibly snow.
Imes said the tire tracks were consistent with Chase's truck, although he warned that the measurements for the depressions could not be 100% accurate. The prosecution also turned to the potential murder weapon found in one of the graves, the 3-pound sledgehammer. He said the items pulled from the graves, the child's backpack, and remnants of a terry cloth or a towel, floor mat type material, all tied back to the McStay's house. He reiterated their belief that the family was murdered at the home.
It is a reasonable interpretation that something happened in that house. Something disabled the McStays, rendered them unable to fight back, allowed them to be secreted from that residence, where they ultimately are found dead of multiple blunt force trauma in a grave an hour or so north of their home. What exactly happened in that house? Only one person knows. The killer. What exactly happened in that house and how evidence of what happened in that house was cleaned up and hidden, only the killer knows.
He highlighted the DNA found belonging to Chase on the steering wheel of the McStay's vehicle, saying it was proof that he had driven the car to the shopping plaza by the Mexican border, in hopes of confusing authorities. After laying out all their evidence, Imes wanted the jury to consider who Chase Merritt really was, Joseph's close friend, so Chase could come into the McStay's house without raising any alarms or frightening their dogs. He wasn't a stranger, so there would be no loud ruckus, no kicking down the door of his victims. Chase was employed as a manufacturer, someone who worked with tools for a living and drove a truck, lugging supplies. Chase had the means to commit 4 murders and then take the bodies into the desert, an area he was familiar with. There was no bloody crime scene, Imes acknowledged, but that didn't matter.
What you have, ladies and gentlemen, is an overwhelmingly convincing set of circumstantial evidence that no matter which way you look at it, no matter which way you turn the wheel, it always comes back to that center point being the defendant. It always comes back to the man with the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit that murder.
Then the defense got their final chance to tell their side.
Justice will not be given when you convict an innocent man.
Defense attorney James McGee accused the prosecution of trying to paint Chase as a bad person and focusing on the business instead of showing evidence that Chase committed 4 murders. They ignored facts and witnesses that didn't fit their contrived story, he said.
They didn't develop a theme of guilt of murder. What they do? Well, let's talk about motive. Let's not talk about the murder. Let's talk about why he's a bad person. They tried his character and not the facts of this case. They want you to focus on hatred and emotion. Hate Mr. Merritt and have sympathy for the family.
McGee reminded the jury that his client was presumed innocent and that the burden was on the state.
We don't have to prove an alibi. We don't have to prove where he was. Apparently, you're off the grid if nobody calls you. Your phones have not rang during the day. You've been off the grid, according to the people. When you're sleeping at night in your bed, you're off the grid.
One by one, he went through the prosecution's arguments. Joseph wasn't trying to sideline Chase from the business, he said. He needed Chase. Joseph was the mastermind who designed and sold the elaborate customized water fountains and waterfalls. But Joseph didn't know how to construct them. Chase did. At the start of 2010, the two weren't talking about owing each other money. They were talking about making money. They had ambitious plans ahead, big projects on their radar, and they looked to profit from it, he said.
If Joseph did not fire Chase on the 4th, this case is done. There's no motive. Let me say that one more time. This is how easy this is. If Joseph did not fire Chase, this case is over. Everything else is fluff. Everything else is a story. Everything else is misdirection. If he didn't get fired, there's no motive. And there's all the evidence points that he was not fired.
The change in business practices, why the checks had been written from a different side of business, why they were deleted, has a reason, he said. Joseph had finally bought out Dan from the business, and he wanted to keep the information hidden from him. It was Joseph who started that practice. It was a short-term fix until they could get it offline. Even after Joseph's disappearance, Chase was just continuing that practice. And after each time the checks were made and deleted in Joseph's account, phone records showed that Chase would then call Joseph. For example, on February 2nd, the checks were created and deleted at 11:37 a.m. At 11:46 a.m., Chase called Joseph and the call lasted for more than 3 minutes. On February 5th, after the McStays disappeared, checks were created and deleted at 12:39 p.m. Chase called Joseph at 12:49 p.m. And after Chase called QuickBooks on February 8th and February 9th, records show he placed calls to Joseph's cell phone afterwards. During the February 4th lunch meeting, McGee said there had actually only been 6 calls between Chase and his wife. It made sense why Chase's wife was calling as the lunch meeting stretched on as they talked business. Only one call connected, and it was 4 minutes long, he said. Chase called her back quickly for a minute. Nothing out of the ordinary, he said. If you're buying the People's story that Chase was fired after that meeting, that does not coincide with what Joseph did after he left, McGee said.
When you fire somebody as a boss, maybe you've been a boss before, when you fire an employee, do you call them afterwards to see how they're doing? Firing somebody is like breaking up with somebody. After you break up with somebody, do you call them and see how they're doing? No. The person who got fired or the person who got broken up with calls that person and tries to convince them otherwise. That's not what happened here. After that meeting, Joseph called Chase 7 times. 7. And not one call from Chase to Joseph. If Joseph fired Chase, Joseph would have never called Chase. You pull that Band-Aid off, the last thing you want to do is stick it back on. That makes no sense.
As for Chase's phone being off the grid at certain times, he said Chase had a history of missing towers on his phone, evidence that he had a crappy, unreliable phone. Again, nothing unusual from Chase's regular life, but it had been misinterpreted by the prosecution and cast as an anomaly.
He went down on the 4th to kill him with a plan. Obviously, he turned off his phone. And he himself is able to corral 4 people and kill them without leaving any evidence in the house. A husband and wife and 2 toddlers can be corralled by one person with no noise, no screams, no signs of violence. This is their theory.
McGee brought up the neighbor's grainy surveillance video, which only showed a part of the road by her house. "We're not stupid," he told the jury. He described a prosecution's expert who had analyzed the poor quality video and took weird measurements to try and connect it with Chase's truck. "It's not his vehicle," he said. He accused the prosecution of doctoring the video and of paying expert witnesses to give them the testimony they wanted. All acts of desperation to make Chase look guilty. McGee also argued that the prosecution's timeline didn't make sense as they built their case.
Their theories contradict themselves. They're not making any sense with what they're saying.
He said the family couldn't have been killed on February 4th. They survived at least until the morning of February 5th, when Chase was driving to Los Angeles, because the McStays were cooking eggs and had let their dogs out. Under the prosecution's timeline, they believed the family was buried on February 6th, which had been a rainy day. The weather conditions had helped preserve the 2 sets of tire tracks over the years. If it had rained, how could someone have dug 2 graves in the wet sand, he argued. The bodies couldn't be completely covered, so based on that logic, the McStays must have been buried February 7th. McGee also pointed to the DNA found at the gravesite that did not match Chase and the McStays. Who the DNA belonged to was undeterminable. It was considered touch DNA from whoever had handled the items recovered in the graves.
That there tells you Merritt didn't do it. Add on, he had no reason to because he wasn't fired. He didn't drive down the house to get him. He wasn't at the gravesite. But the evidence in the grave says it's not him. If that's not reasonable doubt, I don't know what is.
He said the prosecution got the wrong guy, but they won't admit it.
If they admit they made a mistake and arrested the wrong guy, how's that going to look? This is a national case. There's been press releases. There's been shows. They've made promises to the family. Don't worry, we got them. We got them. How do you go back to that family and say, we might have messed up? This case is brought forward not on evidence, but on egos and pride. Throw it up and see what sticks. It's a line you hear in the halls of the DA's office at times. It's disgusting. Throw it up and see what sticks. Because they have no skin in the game. If they're wrong, they don't go to jail. Nothing happens to them. There's no risk.
As the defense's closing arguments were winding down, they made one last mention of Dan Kavanaugh, reminding the jury that Dan had sold the business after Joseph's death. McGee told the jury that the prosecution never called Dan as a witness because they didn't want to open that can of worms. This case screams not guilty, McGee said. A few minutes after the conclusion of the defense's closing arguments, with the jury out of the courtroom, there were heated moments between the defense team and the prosecutors in front of the judge. The prosecutors argued that the defense brought up Dan Kavanaugh's absence in the closing arguments, something the judge had said was off limits in a previous court order. Supervising Deputy District Attorney Britt Imes also accused the defense of professional misconduct, with things McGee had said about the prosecution during the closing arguments. But the judge told them to respond to the defense's allegations in their rebuttals. The jury returned to the courtroom. San Bernardino County Deputy District Attorney Melissa Rodriguez handled the rebuttal.
This is not the People versus Dan Kavanaugh. This is not a case against Sean Doherty, Britt Imes, Melissa Rodriguez, despite the fact that we've been attacked constantly throughout it. This is the case of the People versus Charles Merritt, the defendant.
Rodriguez said there was no evidence that Joseph wanted to hide his financial information on the QuicksBooks ledgers from Dan Kavanaugh.
But when they realized that they needed somebody else to pin this on, that's who it became. Because there is not one shred of evidence that you have received in this courtroom that tells you something had to be hidden from Dan Kavanaugh. Elephant in the room, Dan Kavanaugh. Dan Kavanaugh is the killer. That's what you're being told, right? That's what you're being fed.
She said whether it was right or wrong, Dan Kavanaugh had taken $7,000 from Joseph's business. But it was after the McStays had disappeared to keep the business afloat, while Chase had forged checks and stole business money while Joseph was still alive. She said Dan was in Hawaii at the time of the murders. The deputy district attorney also tried to cast doubt on the defense's investigation into the DNA collected from the items at the gravesite. The defense hadn't run the matches in the FBI's National DNA Database, that's called CODIS.
And that was from touch DNA, right? Touch. Simple touch. Not bodily fluids. Not blood. But yet, the victim's DNA, which is clearly from bodily fluids, because they sat in those graves for 3 years, 9 months, and 7 days, and decomposed. But yet somehow their DNA was chopped up into these tiny little pieces, and we couldn't read any of it. But we find these at least 3 unique profiles that you can run. That doesn't even make sense. And in fact, Dr. Perlin even said the science is good, but sometimes it doesn't apply in every case.
She pointed out that the defense paid more than $100,000 for its DNA witnesses to testify. Talk about people getting paid to give their opinions, she said. The defense also made it seem like the desert was like Noah's Ark up there on February 6th from all the rain and water flowing everywhere, a scenario that would make it impossible to dig in the sand. But in reality, she said, it was an inch of rain over a 24-hour period. But in reality, she said, It was an inch of rain over a 24-hour period. She also accused the defense counsel of taking the evidence out of context. While his best friend was missing, she said Chase went gambling on February 9, proof that he wasn't concerned about the McStays at all.
Your duty, when you go back into that room, is to consider only the things inside of the circle. The testimony, the exhibits, and the instructions. You cannot consider the things outside of the circle. The personal attacks, public opinion, sentiment, sympathy, penalties, despite the fact that the defense tried to get you to say, hey, you need to be able to sleep at night, right? So come back with a not guilty verdict. You don't get to consider those things. You consider the facts and the evidence in this case with the instructions that the judge provided you.
When she was finished speaking, the jury began their deliberations. On June 10, 2019, they reached their verdict. Chase Merritt was guilty of murdering the McStay family. Outside the courtroom, Chase's defense team held a press conference with reporters, reiterating their client's innocence.
Well, obviously, we're devastated, disappointed. We're kind of shell-shocked, actually. Based on the evidence, we did not expect this. But, from our standpoint, our client is innocent. So the fight doesn't stop here with us.
The next part of the trial began, the penalty portion, as Chase's defense team fought for his life. Before Chase's sentencing, Joseph and Summer's family and friends tearfully took the stand and recounted how much they loved and missed the McStays in their victim impact statements. Summer's ex-husband described a random encounter when he met Summer out on the street. By then, she had Gianni and was pregnant with Joe Jr. Her ex remembered thinking how wonderful it was that Summer had found love again and was starting her family. He spoke fondly of her as someone who loved to read and was smart. Joseph's mother described the heartbreak she felt, the decade-long nightmare of wondering where her son and daughter-in-law were and waiting for justice to be carried out. She had been robbed of seeing her 2 grandsons grow up. In January 2020, the judge sentenced Chase to death. After the sentencing, members of the McStay family, as well as the prosecution, gathered outside the courthouse to speak to reporters. Mike McStay, Joseph's brother, said the verdict had helped give him closure.
I personally am happy with the verdict. I think it was correct and fair. He got a fair trial, and the jury spoke. And no amount of posturing from attorneys or anything else is going to change the facts. And the facts are he's guilty, life without the possibility of parole for my brother, 3 counts of the death penalty for my sister-in-law and my 2 nephews. And that's it. Case closed.
Chase's daughter, Taylor, also gave a statement.
I don't think any of us are surprised about what happened today based on how the rest of the trial went. I think all throughout there was just the evidence didn't get out there that we needed to get out, and the full story wasn't told. And we're ready to keep fighting, and he's ready to keep trying to prove his innocence, regardless of how long that takes. So we're gonna stay behind him every step of the way.
And that's all for this episode. So tell me your thoughts about this case. Do you agree with the verdict? Would you have voted guilty or not guilty if you were on the jury? What did you make of the prosecution's case? Do you agree with their theory of the case, or do you agree with the defense? Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram @CourtJunkie, by tweeting me @CourtJunkiePod, or by emailing me at podcast@CourtJunkie.com. These episodes on the McStay case were written by Gabrielle Russon, with additions by me, Jillian Jalali. And don't forget to subscribe to my Court Junkie channel on YouTube, youtube.com/courtjunkie. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.